In the past few weeks, Iran has been shaken up by the largest protests since the 1979 revolution.
Tonight, tense clashes between protesters and security forces in Iran now turning deadly.
Activists warn that this death toll is likely to rise even higher, making it the most violence that Iran has seen since the years around its 1979 Islamic Revolution.
Locked and loaded, President Trump saying the U.S. is ready to rescue Iranian protesters if they are attacked by authorities.
Mass killings of protesters by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corp, or IRGC, have demonstrated that repression has continued to work due to organizational deficiencies and exploitation of individual pain thresholds. However, internal defections from security forces and strikes by the Bazaari class indicate that the regime is on borrowed time. Without extensive economic reform, the Ayatollah cannot indefinitely count on killing his way to power. It will take an absolute and enduring resolve from the Iranian protesters, as well as support from international power centers to bring about change in the country for the first time in almost 50 years. So, what happened with the most recent protests in Iran? Why were they quelled yet again? Why were they different from before? And what would be needed to finally turn the tide? Welcome to Bottom Line Upfront. Today is Sunday, January 18th, 2026. I'm Noah Tan, and this is BLUF number 9. Regime change in Iran will require the perfect storm, but one might be brewing. Let's first talk about the history of Iran's protests and the long-fought battle. Since 1979, the first major protest was in 1999, where the closure of the reformist newspaper Salam led to the first major youth protests. These protests were quickly quelled by a violent police crackdown. Then there was the 2009 Green Movement, where alleged fraud in the re-election of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad led to mass marches and the death of Nida Aga Sultan. Mass arrests, 150 plus deaths, show trials, and house arrest of leaders quelled these marches. In 2017 to 2018, the day protests. There were high food prices and economic mismanagement, which led to the anti-regime protest, 25 deaths, and 5,000 plus arrests. Sudden internet blackouts and IRGC deployment quelled these protests. In 2019, these protests turned even more deadly with the Bloody Aban uprising, where 300% hike in fuel prices overnight led to a nationwide uprising in 100 plus cities and coupled with US maximum pressure sanctions. However, internet blackout and shoot-to-kill orders led to hundreds to thousands of deaths. Then there was the 2022 Women Life Freedom protests, where the death of Mahsa Amini in morality police custody led to widespread protests by women and Gen Z protesters, burning of hijab and widespread global solidarity and sanctions. Public executions, torture, and systemic blindings by security forces using pellets ended with over 500 deaths and 20,000 arrests. And then most recently, there were the 2025 to 2026 January uprisings. Hyperinflation, total economic collapse, and Bazaari strikes sparked the largest protests since the 1979 revolution. Total communications blackout and mass live fire killings led to the deaths in the thousands. This history has revealed a vicious cycle of protest, kill, quell, and repeat. So why has this repression continued to work? Despite almost 50 years of protests building in intensity and scale, the Iranian clerical regime of absolute repression has continued to quell dissent due to Ayatollah Khamenei's ability to maintain his monopoly on force. Protests have become increasingly unified, but their successes have still been limited by a lack of a centralized coordination authority, as well as an inability to consolidate geographically fragmented movements. The 1999 student protest failed because it was socially and geographically isolated, confined mostly to students and intellectuals in Tehran. When the reformist president, Mohammad Khatami, whom the students had helped elect, distanced himself from the protest and sided with the supreme leader to maintain order, the movement's political oxygen was cut off because protesters were not yet ready to abandon the idea of reformation from within. Likewise, the 2009 Green Movement failed to sustain its momentum due to a movement rooted in its two leaders, Mir Hossein Mousavi and Mehdi Karoubi, and without a deeper command structure. When Mousavi and Karoubi were put on house arrest, the movement was decapitated and the protests lost a clear direction. The 2017 and 2019 protests were the first major tests of individual pain thresholds. As in past protests, lack of unified leadership or clear political alternatives among protesters hindered a practical vision for the future or an operational command structure. But the day protests and Bloody Aban revealed the lines in which the IRGC were willing to cross to scare Iranians into submission. The deliberate killing of protesters, including women and children, exposed the reality that the regime's pain threshold for slaughtering its own people was much higher than what protesters were individually willing to shoulder. An analogy about rowing from my coach comes to mind when I think about the hardening resolve of these protesters. It's you versus the opposition, he says. Both of you stick your hand in the middle and beat each other's fingers with a hammer. The first one to remove their hand loses. In the case of Iran, the IRGC has a much bigger hammer than the protesters. Despite becoming the first truly intersectional movement uniting ethnicities and classes, the Women Life Freedom movement failed to trigger security force defections. The Ayatollah's hammer remained bigger and harder than that of the movement. And while protesters demonstrated incredible resilience against public executions and torture, the IRGC and Basij remained ideologically and economically tied to the regime. So, given that these most recent protests are the biggest since 1979, is this protest a new chapter or the same story in that vicious cycle? What makes these recent protests in Iran any different? After all, as of January 17th, the unprecedented level of violence against protesters and killing of thousands of Iranians has achieved a calm in the storm, at least for now. But while the initial wave of protests has failed to topple the regime, a few notable aspects of this uprising signal deeper structural fractures that cannot be alleviated through the blunt force weapon of repression. The Khamenei regime has lost a few key battlegrounds. First, extreme hyperinflation, crippling economic sanctions, and the crash of the rial have turned the Bazaari class against the regime, which was a critical source of funding for the Ayatollah, signaling that he no longer has any semblance of control over the economy. Second, the collapse of the Assad regime in Syria in 2024 and the crippling US-Israeli strikes on key nuclear sites in 2025 have revealed that it is more incapable than ever of both maintaining domestic order and repelling external military influence. It is simply spread too thin. Third, Khamenei's internal security forces are fragmenting, with some refusing orders to fire into the crowd. Finally, the exiled son of the last Shah, Reza Pahlavi, has taken a much more public role in establishing a plan for political transition, offering the potential for a much-needed figurehead of the resistance movement. As of today, the Ayatollah remains in power. But with his sole reliance on fear and violence to maintain authority, his luck may be running out. What happens when a population forced into submission by the threat of death no longer sees that as its worst fate? As one protester yelled during the protests, quote, "I am not scared. I have been dead for 47 years. In other words, the regime's hand is not impervious to the hammer of the Iranian protesters, especially if its citizenry no longer cares about its broken fingers. So, what causes the collapse of authoritarian regimes, and in what scenarios could we see this one play out in Iran? Let's turn to the theory for a second. How do authoritarian states fail? There are multiple theories on why authoritarian regimes collapse. One such theory suggests that these regimes rest on three pillars of stability. The first being legitimation, the power to rule through active consent, compliance with the rules, passive obedience, or mere toleration within the population. Second, repression, the actual or threatened use of physical sanctions against an individual or organization within the territorial jurisdiction of the state for the purpose of imposing a cost on the target, as well as deterring specific activities and or beliefs perceived to be challenging to government personnel, practices, or institution. And third, co-optation, the capacity to tie strategically relevant actors or a group of actors to the regime elite. This could be through political power, patronage, or group similarities. Military regimes led by personalist leaders are incredibly susceptible to failure for two reasons. First, military officers prioritize the cohesion of the armed forces above political power. If a protest or crisis threatens to split the military into warring factions, the leadership would rather return to the barracks and allow a transition than see the army destroyed from within. Second, personalist leaders consolidate power by co-optation of elites or strategic classes of people. If personalists can no longer pay their rents to the inner circle, co-optation fails. By most accounts, the Iranian regime has lost its legitimacy. The original claim to rule was theocracy, or rule by divine mandate, and revolutionary nationalism. However, the 2024 elections saw a historic low voter turnout, and 70% of Iranians say they oppose the continuation of the Islamic Republic. What's more, the support for religious rule has plummeted to nearly single digits among the youth and urban populations. Then, there is the co-optation pillar, which is failing. In 1979, the Bazaars provided the financial and organizational support necessary to overthrow the Pahlavi government and usher in the Islamic Republic. More importantly, the Bazaars directly fund the Ayatollahs through religious taxes and have been a key ideological ally against Western-style modernization, which provides the economic counterpart to the IRGC's security assurances. When the Bazaari class struck over economic failures, it not only broke the fundamental social contract between the merchants and the Ayatollah, but it also revealed that the IRGC could not run Iran's economy by force. Co-optation in Iran relies on its Anfal system, a dual exchange rate system, which opens regime elites to arbitrage opportunities. Furthermore, the regime has previously been able to circumvent economic sanctions through its shadow economy, financed through the illicit sale of oil from a ghost fleet of tankers. Iranian President Pezeshkian's 2026 draft budget sought to address economic mismanagement by abolishing the preferential exchange rate, leading to mass economic chaos. As the rial hit 145,000 tomans to the dollar in early January 2026, the regime's ability to provide stable wealth to its middle management loyalists evaporated. No money, no rents to the IRGC and political elites. No rents, no co-optation. Iran will soon be left with its last remaining leg of stability: repression. As of today, repression is still working, but it has its limits. Iran's ability to repress future uprisings relies on four key assumptions. First, the regime assumes that there will always be a finite amount of killing the Iranian population can endure before their own safety concerns outweigh hopes for regime change. Second, the regime assumes that its security forces will not defect in significant numbers. Third, the regime assumes that it will be able to credibly deter the US and Israel from militarily supporting regime change attempts by convincing them that such action would lead to a protracted conflict, one not worth their blood and treasure. Lastly, the regime assumes that it can cross the protesters' pain threshold before it crosses Washington and Tel Aviv's non-intervention threshold. So far, the regime has been able to strike this balance, but if future protests become more deadly, I think there is a high chance that it miscalculates the extent to which the world tolerates its violent repression. There are several reasons to believe that the regime is on borrowed time. The most recent protests revealed that there is a limit to what Iran's security forces are willing to do. Analysis from the Institute for the Study of War has concluded that some security force personnel defected or refused to repress the protests. Forces that stayed withdrew from many protest sites, and the deployment of foreign militias suggests that security forces in Iran do not have the bandwidth or willpower to quell certain protests. Additionally, leaks about regime activity and data suggest that there is internal dissent among the different factions of security forces. Could we be seeing a return to the barracks effect here? Maybe so. Then there is the issue of the collapsing axis of resistance. The regime's tolerance for pain has always been bolstered by its regional power. With the fall of the Assad regime in Syria in 2024, Khamenei not only lost his strongest regional ally, but also strategic access to Hezbollah and Mediterranean bases. In addition, the 2025 US-Israeli strikes on key nuclear sites hindered Iran's ability to solidify its regime through nuclear armament a la North Korea. So let's get speculative for a second. What could this perfect storm look like? I have one, again, very speculative scenario here. First, there is repression bandwidth collapse. The regime's attempt to securitize all 31 provinces simultaneously has reached a physical limit. With over 24,000 arrests and 5,000 confirmed deaths as of January 18th, the Basij and Law Enforcement Command, LEC, are suffering from extreme repression fatigue. In this defection scenario, the Artesh, or the regular army, makes a strategic pivot and takes a position of neutrality, refusing to fire at protesters. Then comes the backlash against the over 800 foreign militia fighters imported to Iran to help quell protests. Protesters begin targeting these foreign mercenaries, and rank-and-file Iranian soldiers refuse to share barracks with them, leading to localized skirmishes between the Artesh and foreign proxies. Second, the succession trap snaps. The succession trap refers to a period of regime instability when a long-term leader dies or is ousted without a clear and institutionalized mechanism for transferring power. During the 12-day war back in 2025, Khamenei retreated to an underground bunker with little communication or coordination. Iran's Supreme National Security Council, the IRGC, and even Iran's president were left in the dark. The fissures of the succession lines were beginning to show as Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bahir Ghalibaf unilaterally assumed power and placed Iran under military emergency law for the remainder of the conflict. In this phase of the scenario, questions about Khamenei's health amid crumbling domestic order sowed dissent and paralyzed the assembly of experts charged with electing the new Ayatollah. Third, the strikes and defections spread. The Bazaari strikes that started in December spread to other sectors like energy. Seeing the writing on the wall, mid-level bureaucrats and regime-connected businessmen begin to flip. They reach out to the alternative power centers like Reza Pahlavi or coalitions of strikers to secure amnesties. Fourth, external intervention. US and Israeli forces observed the internal fracturing of regime elites, high-level government institutions, and security forces. Sensing that now is the most opportunistic chance that they will get, they deploy advanced cyber and electronic warfare to completely blind the IRGC's command and control. Depending on regime resistance and threats, they may launch targeted strikes in key military facilities in Tehran, Bandar Abbas, Shahrud, Isfahan, and Zahedan. The regime's ability to coordinate its repression vanishes overnight. Finally, the regime falls. Protesters, backed by Artesh forces, seize control of Seda Vasima, the state media, headquarters, and airport. Regime leaders are either captured or flee, and the theocratic regime collapses. Remember, this is all very speculative. All, none, or a combination of these scenarios could lead to regime collapse. And at the same time, I will not be able to tell you how long physical repression will work for the Khamenei regime. The 1979 theocracy will continue to outlast protesters as long as the international community has one foot out the door. But bullets will not make the price of food go down, nor will they guarantee insulation for external pressures. Protests have stopped being about hopes for freedoms and ideas. They are now centered around basic necessities for survival. I'll end by asking you keep this quote from Irish playwright Terence MacSweeney in mind. It is not those who can inflict the most, but those who can endure the most who will conquer. This has been Bottom Line Up Front. Bottom Line Up Front is written entirely outside of Noah's professional capacity. His views are not necessarily representative of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace or Stanford University. Noah declares no conflicts of interest. All errors are his own. Thanks for listening.